I want to talk for a moment about indoctrination or to indoctrinate. Just that word in general. It seems to, especially in today's society and culture, the word indoctrinate has a very mostly negative connotation, especially if you're in religious circles. If somebody were to, for example, tell you that, oh, you're just indoctrinated, um, it can have a very negative connotation, understandably. But the word indoctrinate, so I always like to define terms because a lot of times culture and society can change the meanings of what words actually mean. Um, so when we refer to somebody as being indoctrinated, what that actually means in its simplest form is that they have been taught. So the word indoctrinate means to teach. It's to instruct in a doctrine, to instruct in a principle or a specific ideology or a point of view. Um, so all of us are indoctrinated in something, whether it be culture, religion, politics, everything. And the way that indoctrination reveals itself is how you explain your point of view. If you was to ask somebody um, their opinion on let's say a hot political topic, how they answer, like you could not know anything about anybody. You could walk up to somebody on the street, you've never met them before in your life, and if you was to ask them their opinion on vaccines or their opinion on um, COVID protocols, how they answer will tell you how they've been indoctrinated. And this especially rings true in religious circles. And like I said, the way that you pick up and pinpoint what somebody's indoctrination is how they answer questions. And I'm going to go back to an example I've used many, many times over the years because it's just what I lived for a long time. I worked from the time I was 18 years old. I worked in automotive sales and marketing. And in that field, every dealership uses, most of them use specific types of sales training. So for example, because if you've never worked in automotive sales and marketing, you may have no idea what I'm talking about. So I'm sure everybody listening to this has at least bought one car in their life. From the time you walk into it, or I should say from the time you pull onto a dealership's parking lot and get out of your car, and let's say you park, you're walking around, you're kind of looking at the vehicles, and a salesperson approaches you and says, "Hi, how are you doing today? What can I help you find?" From that moment until you go through the process, you pick out a car, you negotiate a sale, you walk into the finance office and you sign paperwork, everything about how that sale is handled, the types of word tracks a salesperson uses, the way they negotiate the sale, everything is due to sales training. And I remember when I got into the car business back in it was like 1991, there were two main, I would say when I got into the car business in 91, and then I left in 2009, I believe. It was like the year after Ava was born. During my time in the sales business, there were two major sales training methods that were used in the country. And one of them was called the four square method. So if anybody's in car sales and you hear that, you've been an old time salesperson, you know what I'm talking about. And then another one actually wasn't so much a sales method as it was a company that was doing a lot of training back then. And that's a company that I don't know if they're still around, called Traver Technologies. Traver Technologies was a company that came in and they were really trying to elevate the reputation, I'll call it, of car salesmen, because the four square method was kind of old school. a lot of the car business, a lot of their bad reputation was gained in the 70s and 80s. A lot of the slimy sales techniques that you hear about, a lot of those were started back then. And the Foursquare method goes way back in time. I don't know exactly when it started. I want to say in the 80s. Um, but if everyone, or I should say, not everyone, if anyone wants to watch a movie that I believe is extremely accurate, is an extremely accurate representation of the old style car sales techniques, go watch the movie Suckers. It definitely has some language, but it is so funny. And if you've never worked in car sales, you might think there is no way this is accurate. Trust me, it's accurate. So anyway, I only bring that up because those are the main two that I personally worked with back in the day. And both of those sales training methods came with very specific lingo. And to this day, and I have been out of car sales since 2009. I've been working as a nurse ever since 2011. To this day, I could walk into any car dealership anywhere in the country, and I could just sit and listen to how the salesperson answered questions, and I could tell you what kind of sales training method that dealership was signed up with, especially if they were using the Foursquare, which is still, pretty commonly used today. And a lot of dealerships do still use the Traver Technologies approach. What I started to say earlier, the Foursquare method was kind of old school, and the movie Suckers was definitely built around that sales method. That's why I find it so funny, because it's very accurate. But obviously the car business had a bad reputation for screwing people over and underhanded sales techniques and all of this. And Traver Technologies came about during a time when the sales industry, a lot of the major manufacturers were really trying to move on out of that bad reputation. There was a huge emphasis put on customer relations, making people happy. So it was kind of a cool time in from my recollection to work in the car industry, because I literally lived through the transition from old school, underhanded, slimy sales techniques, and then moved on into the we're going to handle this sale in a much more classy manner, which was the Traver Technologies approach. So that was a long explanation, but I get to talking about that, and it brings back fond memories, because I still very much miss my days in sales and marketing. It was definitely a great time in life and a lot of good memories. But I wanted to bring up that example and just say again that to this day, and I've been out of sales for 16 years or more. And literally that training is so deep, it's so deeply rooted, that I literally could walk in any dealership anywhere in the country and I could spot what training method they're using simply by listening to how the staff talks. And that same identification method, listening for language patterns, can help you identify indoctrination anywhere. And so when I say indoctrination, the Foursquare method of selling, that's a method of indoctrination. When Traver Technologies came along, that was a method of indoctrination. And so again, indoctrination does not necessarily mean a bad thing. In that regard, they were just using it so that they would have uniformity in their sales approach. But again, I really think because of that exposure that I had for so many years, it has helped me to pick up on language patterns. And that's one of the things I always notice. And it's really one of the things that I started to notice when I really started to wake up to the, why I was so confused in the prosperity gospel and why things didn't seem to line up. I started noticing this common lingo. And when it really became apparent is when I would visit other churches outside of my normal circle, because the church that we we lived, or well, lived in, breeze, whatever, the community we were surrounded with from, I want to say 2003 until 2000, late 2021, was known as a prosperity gospel type community. In those circles, they believe that all the gifts of the Spirit are in active use. They believe there's still apostles and prophets. They believe it's always God's will to heal. Most of them teach that physical healing is a promise that was also included in the atonement, and there's many more that I won't go into. But when you're in those circles, they speak a certain way. And you don't necessarily, like, if you've only ever been surrounded by prosperity gospel theology, you may not pick up on it because it's all you've ever known. But I was not raised that way, so I did notice the little catchphrases you would hear a lot. And it became especially noticeable when you would visit another church. For example, if we would go visit a family member that maybe went to a conservative Baptist church, or there was a few times, for example, that I visited my brother's, my brother married into a Catholic family. So there was a few times that I visited the Catholic church for different various things. And there was a difference. The whole culture, the whole way they speak, the whole everything is different. And so I picked up on the fact that, why do they say these things? And when we first left the prosperity gospel, I did a deep dive because I wanted to know, like, where do these little unique phrases come from? And, you know, for example, if you're in prosperity gospel circles, you'll hear the term, like when they're talking about the Sunday offering, they'll say things like sow a seed, reap a harvest, sow a seed into the kingdom. Or you'll hear things like, I was speaking in my private prayer language. Or you'll hear things like, God gave me a word for you. And I literally took months and looked into all of these little phrases, like, where did they start? Who started them? And they did have an origin point. And so again, that is a type of indoctrination. People who have spent time in prosperity, word of faith type circles have been indoctrinated into that theology, and they start to speak the language. Because I had just done all of that with the prosperity word of faith gospel that we had just left, when we started going to the Church of Christ, which was in June of 2022, I once again, I think just my brain was already turned on to it. I once again noticed the language patterns, and it was language that you only heard within Church of Christ circles. And so I remember that I started once again looking into, where do these phrases come from? Because one of the big things you'll hear in the Church of Christ, and I'm not saying this in a condescending manner. I'm just speaking facts. In non-institutional Church of Christ circles, you'll hear phrases like, we don't follow men. We only follow the Bible. Or you'll hear things like, the Bible is our only authority. So they really make a big deal about only following the Bible. And I remember in the very beginning, that was very attractive to my husband and I, because we had just come out of a group that, not that they didn't follow the Bible, but it seemed like so much of the claims that they made were based on emotion and extra biblical. And, for example, if somebody would say, God gave me a word, and that word didn't come true, I would say, after a while, we started to question things and say, well, how do you know that was from God? They would give you a myriad of answers, but most of them were just based on emotion. And so back to the Church of Christ, after we were in it for about 6 months, a little bit less, there were a lot of problems. There were a lot of things going on behind the scenes. And so I really attribute even though it was an awful it was an awful phase of life to go through, dealing with all of the yuck that was going on behind the scenes with our Church of Christ experience. Um, I look back now and I really appreciate it, because what was going on behind the scenes forced me to pay attention closer. And so I really became honed in on everything. I very much am an observer. If somebody makes an off-color comment, or if somebody says something that maybe doesn't line up, I'm usually the type that doesn't say something right away. I'll stand back and watch and listen. Because what I'm doing is whether it's intentional or unintentional, subconscious, conscious, whatever, um, I'm looking for patterns, because all of us can screw up, and all of us can lie. All of us can be manipulative from time to time. All of us can be, jerks and say things we don't mean, all of that thing. So all of us are capable, myself included, of ugly behavior. But if it's just a one-off, or maybe somebody's having a bad day and it's a result of stress or whatever, that's different than realizing that that is a pattern and that is who somebody is. That's a huge difference. And so there were a lot of inconsistencies with the Church of Christ, and I noticed it right away. And I sat back and watched. My husband and I would have many conversations, like after church service, or let's say that we were involved in a conversation where some comments were made that just didn't sit right. Because we both kind of are in the same category as far as like how we handle things. We usually don't confront things right away. We usually kind of stand back and observe. And so there were a lot of conversations that we were having privately, like, hey, did you catch what that person said? And, what do you think about that? And so we were, there was so much going on. And so one of the things I noticed was the non-institutional, specifically the non-institutional Churches of Christ, have very unique language that only exists within those circles. And as someone who was not born and raised Church of Christ, I picked up on it. Now, I will say, and I want to be clear, that just because they have unique lingo does not mean it's a problem. Every religious group has its own unique little spin on the way that they talk, the way that they interpret scripture, the way that they refer to things. Like, every religious group has their level of indoctrination, right? Indoctrination is not a bad thing. But I did notice pretty shortly after we started this unique language pattern. And so to me, when I would hear the men at the Church of Christ really emphasize, we only use the Bible, we don't follow men, we only use the Bible, and simultaneously I'm seeing very clear signs of indoctrination. One of the things that I did before we left the Church of Christ, we were already mentally like detangling ourselves for months prior to actually making the announcement to leave. But one of the things that I did, because I'm a person, I hate to make a wrong decision. I hate to move too quickly. I hate to make a wrong judgment. We were pretty certain of our decision, but there was one thing I did before we left, and this was just my mental way of dotting my I's and crossing my T's. So within Church of Christ circles, one of the big triggers, I mean, if you want to trigger a Church of Christ preacher, just tell them that you want to be saved like the thief on the cross. Yeah. So that specific topic came up in our original Bible studies, because I'm pretty sure that anyone who's not born and raised Church of Christ, if they're in a Bible study with a Church of Christ preacher, that they're probably at some point going to say the same thing we did. They're probably going to say, well, what about the thief on the cross? Because one of the things that they were trying to convince us of is that baptism is a requirement for salvation. Like, baptism is the point that you contact the blood of Christ in the water. Baptism is the point that your sins are washed away. And I remember they were really like taking us to all these verses and breaking this down and showing us that, and by the way, my husband and I are totally on board with, if you identify as a Christian, you should be baptized. It's just, it was the model given. But we didn't believe that it was the point that your sins were washed away, that it was a requirement. Like, I remember we even gave them the example of like, well, what if there's a guy that, believes in Jesus and, accepts the gospel, all that stuff, and they're hit by a car on the way to the baptismal. And I mean, if you ask that question to 10 different Church of Christ preachers, you're probably going to get 10 slightly different answers. But the hardcore ones are going to say, well, I mean, he didn't get baptized. So, but in the days leading up to us leaving, I sat down because we knew a lot of preachers in the Church of Christ. I think it's just because we studied with two well-known Church of Christ preachers that were well connected, I want to say, in the community. And so just knowing them, we were connected to a lot of other preachers. And so we knew a lot of preachers. And, I knew a preacher down in Tennessee. I knew a preacher in Kentucky. I knew several in Ohio. I knew one in Pennsylvania. I knew several in Indiana. I knew a preacher in Texas. So we knew a lot of preachers, right? And a lot of them didn't know each other. So right before we left, I sent a text message to 3 different preachers, and none of them knew each other. They did not run in the same circles. And I asked all of them the same question about the new covenant and when it began, and about the thief on the cross. I asked them very specific questions. Or let me rephrase. Yes, I did ask them very specific questions, but I asked all of them the same questions. I think I asked all of them 3 questions because I wanted to see how they were going to answer. And I'll be darned if every single preacher answered the question the same way, using the same word tracks, using the same approach. It was clear indoctrination. And I remember I was in the process of compiling a letter because we were trying to plead with the people in our community, like, hey, we can't stay here. There was a lot of awful things going on, but we knew we had to leave for the spiritual health of our family. And so I was writing a letter that took me quite a while to compose. It was very long. But one of the things I included in this letter was letting them know, hey, you are all using the same words to answer questions. That points to teaching. And it wasn't my intention to disrespect anybody or anything like that. It was intended to try to reason with them. And we realized very quickly there was no reasoning with them. But I just wanted to share that if you was to ask, if you was to take 10 Christians and put them in a room and not tell me what denomination they were in, and if I was to ask all 3 of those Christians, or I'm sorry, all 3, all 10, if I was to ask all 10 of those Christians the same question about a Bible passage, ask them to interpret a Bible passage to me, I can almost guarantee you that I could listen to how they explained it. And I could tell you whether they were Arminian, Reformed, non-denominational, prosperity gospel, or in some type of works-based group like the Church of Christ. You can tell by listening to people explain their beliefs how they were taught.